So I sent around a document to the students who are due to be here with details for this class, and what I might do is I might attach that here because it would be useful to get your hands on that. So I'll put it into the chat. So I have into my chat, and I'm going to attach a file from my computer, and it will be desktop, open day documents, and the open day class. So that will be available there for everybody. So you can click on that document, and what it's got is the rough topic that I'm going to be talking about briefly and a bunch of different resources that go with it. There's a Dropbox link on there that will give you a link to the notes that are relevant. So that's a little piece out of the notes book that gets given to the biology students. And you can be following along what we're doing there. It's very little because of obviously the time that's left. I know that I'm going to have somebody arriving in directly behind me. That'll be Lorraine with chemistry. So let's get to it. So my classes generally are based on PowerPoint. I find PowerPoint is the best for me because there is a lot of visual information in biology. The visual element is important to me. I think that students learn in lots of different ways. So as well as talking about a topic, as well as looking at text about a topic, I think that visual information and visual communication is very important. It's not just because of that, but it's also because students will need to be able to draw diagrams. Sometimes the biology test that we get at the end of the IFY will require drawing in order to communicate your answer. The topic that I chose is something that the students have not actually done. This year, our syllabus was changed in that a lot of material was cut from it. The course was shortened, and that was because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it meant that there's a slightly shorter syllabus and slightly earlier exams. So this topic is my favorite. I always liked the topic of Mendelian genetics when I was in high school and in university, and it's something that I pursued while I was in university. So let me share here. So most of my classes begin this way with a set lesson in the book. In this case, on page 67, the human Mendelian genetics lesson begins. And this lesson, as you can see, runs through the pages of 67 right through page 74, and then there's a series of exercises on page 75, 76, 79, 76, 77, all the way up to page 80, including a worksheet. Now, not every lesson in my book has so many exercises. However, genetics is one of those classes where a lot of practice is required in order to get comfortable with it. Some students naturally love it, and others need a little bit of practice in order to get kind of familiar with it. So I sent out also, as you can see on the class document there, that there was a YouTube video for pre-reading. And so I was kind of hoping that maybe several or most of the students who are here would have taken a look at that, because even though we would normally be moving through the slides, in this case, the material has not been done by them, yesterday or the previous class. So where I wanted to start was at slide, I think about 21. I wanted to look at where it moves on to actual human genetics. Yeah, one moment. So I will be looking at slide 21. Okay, so at this point, we would have discussed already how Mendel was working with pea plants. We would have come across some terms already that would be important for us. We would have looked at, for example, the term that means the different versions of a gene that exist. So, did anybody take a look at the pre-reading? Like, let me just call on somebody. Did you take a look at the video, Tiffany? Or maybe a better question would be to ask, if I was to ask you about what I meant by the different versions of a gene, do you know the term that is associated with that?
Like the genotype and phenotype.
Yeah, but a particular term. So, for example, when you're talking about genotype, you have two different versions of a gene, or they could be two of the same versions of a gene, but they are one version of which there are many in the population. We use a term that refers to these individual separate versions. What is that?
Allele?
Alleles, yeah. So allele. So it'll be important that we are using that term. So we're referring to the different versions of a gene. We would have that already. Likewise, you also mentioned something there, genotype and phenotype, and this stuff is pretty important. So so we often will be associating these terms with the beginning of the problems that we need to solve. So in a genetics problem, you will often be given what the parents in a cross have, so the versions that they have, or you may be told what their outward appearance is. And so those two terms are associated with that. So do you know which one is which, Jawahar? Would you mind if I asked you a question on that? Are you with me?
Sorry, what?
No problem at all. The terms genotype and phenotype would have been mentioned in that video. One of them referring to the actual alleles that the individual has, and one of them referring to the observable appearance, you know, what they actually appear like to the outside world. Do you know which is which between genotype and phenotype?
Not really, but
That's okay.
I can guess maybe.
Yeah, that's no problem. The combination of alleles is what we call the genotype, and the actual appearance, or what actual trait appears in the individual, is called the phenotype. Yeah. And we're going to use particular notation when we get to that with different letters for the alleles, but we'll get to that in a moment. So we would have looked at a lot of this material already with Mendel and his pea plants. But of course, when we get to human genetics, we need to change a little bit how we think about it, because humans are not pea plants. There are many reasons why they are not suitable candidates for carrying out genetic experiments. For example, there are many ethical problems about reproduction in humans, and of course they would be unsuitable. Subjects because they have got too few offspring and their generation time is too long. So you cannot decide what offspring, you cannot manipulate the mating patterns of humans, but in order to apply Mendel's laws to human genetics, you need to look at the outcomes of crosses that have already occurred. So babies that have been born. And so we're going to be looking at the idea of using pedigrees. So a pedigree, that's the term in bold on this slide, is looking at a picture of several generations of a family. The pattern of inheritance can often be detected by looking at individuals, how they are related, who has got a particular trait in their phenotype and who has not. So an inheritance pattern is one of the things that you will be expected to be able to detect from a pedigree. You can also use the pedigree then to make a prediction about a particular cross, because human genetics is often about expectant parents saying, what are the chances that a problem or a genetic situation could occur in the baby that we are going to have? When we look at pedigree diagrams, we will see them listed like this. Males and females listed as squares and circles, with shading being the trait. So an affected male or an affected female. One moment. Okay. So here's an example of a pedigree. The photos apparently are genuine. These two are two sisters. On the pedigree, they're represented as sisters because they are both connected to the same pair of individuals. Here we have got, in each case, square being male, circle being female. A horizontal line represents a mating or a crossing, so two partners that had a baby. From each parent couple, there will be a horizontal line representing the siblings. And so we can see, as we work our way down, we can see that these two individuals are both female. They are both connected to the same set of parents, so they are sisters. So this is showing the trait of widow's peak. Widow's peak refers to the notch in the hairline. So if you look at the hairline of each of the individuals, as the hair comes across, how it is notched. Yeah, you can see this widow's peak on everybody who has a hairline that can be seen on a zoom camera. So widow's peak is a trait. This is not a genetic disease or a condition. There's no such thing as being right or wrong when it comes to it, but it's simply a trait that's passed through the family. So this trait is demonstrated by this person on the left. Their circle is shaded because they have the trait. And the question, of course, is, can we look at this diagram and say, this trait is dominant or this trait is recessive? So we need to look at those terms again. Can you remember, Priscilla, what the difference is between dominant and recessive, if you don't mind me asking?
Dominant is the one that can be seen, I think, like the stronger one.
Good.
And recessive is the less stronger one.
Yep, excellent. What we typically do is we typically will discuss dominant and recessive in terms of the dominant allele. So we say the dominant allele shows itself. It is expressed. It appears in the phenotype anytime it is present. Whereas the recessive allele, what we'll say is the recessive allele will not be seen if the dominant one is present. So we define both of them in terms of the dominant one. Yeah. But the question here, of course, is this a dominant or is this a recessive trait? So we know we've already used the notation for our alleles. Do we remember we've used letters for our alleles? Maybe you can remember, Sabrina, when we use letters for alleles, do we use the same letter or different letters? Do we use uppercase or lowercase?
We use the same letter, but
Yeah.
for the dominant one, we use a capital one, but for the recessive, it's a small letter.
Yeah. And we always choose our letters pretty carefully, I think. We use letters like G and K and T a lot because they look different in handwriting, uppercase and lowercase. But I'm going to use a terrible one here because I'm going to use W for widow's peak. So let's take a look and see if we can identify whether this is a dominant or a recessive trait. So what we've done here is we've said, okay, well, let's assume something for a moment. Let's assume that widow's peak is recessive. So when we have a recessive trait, of course, we must only have the recessive allele present. And that's because our definition of recessive decides that. Recessive, remember, is only expressed when the dominant is absent. So if widow's peak were a recessive trait, that would mean every person on this pedigree must be from a shaded square or a shaded circle. So we go through all our shaded circle and we put little W's in place. And that's fine. Some of the boxes we don't know, like the people in the second generation, the two brothers on the left and the sister on the right, we don't know exactly whether they what they have, but that's not important because take a look at the parents of these two subjects. Both of these must have had two small letters. They must have had two small recessive alleles, which is fine for explaining how the sister on the left received her widow's peak. But how would it explain what's going on with the sister on the right? So oftentimes in pedigree analysis, what we're really trying to do, much the same as in all empirical science, is we're not trying to prove something is true, but rather we're trying to prove something is untrue. And then we can revert to the remaining situation. So our first hypothesis was, is widow's peak recessive? And we can conclusively say, no. The pedigree shows that it is not recessive. But if we run the alternate, where only the ones that are blank get small w, that means that we can conclusively work out the genotype of both of the parents. They must be big, small, meaning dominant recessive or heterozygous. And that means that the sister on the right can easily be explained. She received a recessive allele from each of her parents that were both heterozygous. The sister on the left, we don't know. Maybe she has two capital letter W's, or maybe she has one capital and one small, but that doesn't matter. We are at least able to clearly see that widow's peak must be a dominantly inherited trait. So this test of writing down the genotypes on top of every one that you know for sure, according to your hypothesis, This method is the first test that you're going to do on any pedigree that you look at. You will also be doing a separate test, which is to establish whether or not it is sex-linked or whether it is not sex-linked. But obviously, I'm at 22 minutes past 10 and I don't have any time to move on to that. So my apologies for starting late, but what I'll do is I'll make sure that I can hand over to Lorraine for chemistry in good order and not transmit the lateness forward. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about the little bit that we did cover here today?
No.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Obviously, this entire lesson would be taught over not 20 minutes of class, but it would be taught over 1 or 2 double 2-hour sessions, and then there would be a lot of problems involved in getting it right. So on the documents that I've circulated there, you can look at the notes for the full lesson, and there is a full booklet of genetics type problems, which range from the very easy ones to very hard ones. So all of you are welcome to tackle any of those, and my email is on the list there. This goes for current students and for visitors. You're welcome to send me a completed problem, and I would be only delighted to look at it and give you some feedback on that. Cool. So thanks very much for listening to me, and what I'll do is I will stop my PowerPoint here.